Let me see if anyone's on Bear Share or whatever that's called. What's it called? Discord. Yeah. I was supposed to stream and if we do a video on the soy bomb thing when he was playing Lovesick. That was great. But he's not really prime time guy, you know. But yeah, he's in his late 70s. He's still doing it. It's vented dimension. It has to be real. Well, the one thing that makes me think it's real, the astral plane, is because, well, first of all, you know, a lot from Edgar Casey. There's all kinds of stories about reincarnation, especially this one kid who was drawn. Every time when he's a little kid, he's like 3 years old. He's getting a piece of paper and he's drawing this big mess. And his parents are like, what is that? It's the battle at sea. And he'd have ships shooting at planes and planes. And one day, I guess he was in his dad's closet and he had himself a little cockpit hooked up and everything. And he knew everything. He said his name was James, and he flew off a carrier. I mean, how the heck would a 3 or 4 year old know this, right? And so he says one day he's in his dad's closet and this little airplane he's got concocted in there. He comes rolling out of the closet and his dad said, "Are you okay?" He goes, "Yeah, I had to bail out." Well, anyways, it got so uncanny that they finally found there was a ship. The name he said, his plane, he had something about his plane, and he talked about his buddies on the ship with him, and they found him. And he found that he died and crashed into the water and drowned. He couldn't get out, couldn't open his cockpit. So, and then once they went there with the boy had a really severe reaction when they were throwing a reef in the water. And then after it was over, the boy acted like, he's like, the guy was gone. His presence was gone from him. I don't know if that meant, I don't think it was that guy. I think it was that identity. Because for some reason, when we cross over, something happens that we can't remember our previous life. But when now, I don't know, there's a lot of people that think that we're part of a big cheese sandwich. And there's other people that say that we're our own self. We're our own entity, that we are on Earth. And I would prefer that one. I don't want to scatter into 1,000 different directions. But then again, and then when you think about it though, but forever is an awful long time. We talk about muse because either we are spirits or we're not. Well, I found out there was a guy in the early 1900s who was weighing people at their moment of death. He didn't weigh that many, but he got to weigh a few, and they found that they lost 28 grams, every one of them. So the weight of our spirit or soul is 28 grams. All right, I'll do the Don Scott video just in case. Here it is. Found an interesting article here. NASA pseudo-skeptic receives rebuttal from Electric Universe by Don Scott. Editor's note. On March 16th, Dr. Don E. Scott gave a presentation of Electric Universe concept to a gathering at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, which appeared to be well received by many of the attendees. However, there he met with pseudo-skeptic Dr. Tom Bridgman, who had offered a critique of Scott's book, The Electric Sky, last year, and who, while personable to Scott's face, has since written further pseudo-criticism of Scott's presentation. The following are a few excerpts from Scott's rebuttal of Bridgman's original critique. The guy's a mainstream, and, they come up with the weakest excuses. Let's see. When I first heard about Dr. Tom Bridgman's 48-page onslaught against me and the material presented in my book, The Electric Sky, I thought I'd simply ignore him. But friends I admire and trust have repeatedly implored me to take up my pen so that the casual reader of his criticism will not assume I accept them. These following paragraphs are not a comprehensive dissection each and every. They are simply my reaction to what stood out in Bridgman's script here. No thanks. The following is my response to Bridgman, roughly in the order in which he states his objection. Pulsars. On the top of his page 2, TB implies that I have proposed a radically different model of pulsars. The notion that a pulsar repetition rates are most probably due to an electrical oscillation rather than lighthouse-like stars rotating at 60,000 RPM or more is due not to me, but to other investigators such as Healy and Peratt. See their paper here. 19. Those authors begin their peer-reviewed paper with a review of the history of the discovery of pulsars. Oh, that's always interesting, looking at the history of discovery. And the classical theoretical descriptions of their behavior. They, H&P, performed a plasma-supported transmission line experiment that duplicated some 17 detailed properties of those observed emissions. I have read their paper, discussed this with Peratt personally, and find much merit in what they say. Postulating this electrical mechanism as an explanation for observed pulsar emissions is far less of a stretch of one's sense of reality than proposing that an incredibly massive star rotates with the speed of a dentist drill. But H&P's proposed model is regrettably misrepresentations of what I say. Yeah. On this page 4, Bridgman states, Dr. Scott states, astronomers assume that the physical laws in the distant cosmos are different from those known on Earth. What did I say? And what I did say in part was this. The hypothesis of these plasma scientists on the subjects of solar, stellar, and galactic behavior are careful extrapolations of their demonstrated experimental results and physical principles. They do not involve invisible matter or unseen forces or new science. Claims that the laws of physics must be different out there in deep space, where we cannot falsify them from what they are here on Earth, no doubt. I have indeed heard arguments that just because something is falsified here on Earth doesn't mean it can't happen in space. For example, see the section of this rebuttal on impossibility of neutron stars below. His TBs claim that matter made up solely of neutrons can and does exist out in space, despite the fact it cannot here on Earth, is a case in point. He also mentions there are some searches for dark matter and dark energy candidates that are being conducted in Earth laboratories. I hope I live long enough to see positive results of these searches announced. I doubt I will. It looks like X, so it must be X. TB condemns my pointing out that a similarity in appearance of certain objects might indicate they have common cause, e.g., the Grand Canyon and Lichtenberg patterns formed by lightning strokes in glass when he then goes on to say that Mark Twain noted how the Mississippi River course would change, with no reports of giant electric arcs. There are many morphological characteristics to the Grand Canyon that are enigmatic for standard geologists, different from the Mississippi, and similar to Lichtenberg patterns. I mean, where did all the debris go? They never can answer that. They just ignore that. It has no delta. It is narrow at both ends, and its tributaries are as deep at their beginning point as they are when they join the main stream. Mainstream. Many such tributaries join at right angles to the Central Valley, and of course, it is a mile deep. Also, there is a saying, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Yeah, it is a duck. Figure 1, the electric figure etched in grass by lightning, not to be confused with the Mississippi River Valley. It's grass, I thought I saw him in glass. Maybe it's both, grass and glass. More like creationism than I expect. Page 44, TB seems to take offense at the degree to which I talk about plasma when it is in the dark current of operation. Earth's ionosphere, for example, or the outer interplanetary plasma. He states, much of Scott's model hides connections behind invisible dark currents. Oh yeah, what about invisible dark matter? These currents seem to fulfill in Scott's theology the role of God in creationist. Well, the one difference between plasma and dark mode and dark energy and dark matter, which I'm sure you know already, is that the plasma can be seen through radio. I submit this comment coming from a staunch supporter of fairy dust, fabricated ad hoc inventions repeatedly invoked in efforts to defend untenable scientific theories. Fairy dust. Entities such as black holes, dark energy, dark matter, and neutron stars is the epitome of hypocrisy. In his zeal to play citizen Robespierre to anything that challenges his belief structure, he seems to see the ghost of creationism lurking everywhere, isn't it? Even when it is clearly not. Does he feel no unease when it was George Lemaitre, a Roman Catholic priest who was one of the inventors of his beloved Big Bang myth? It is well known that one of the early general appeals of the BB was that it bridged the gap between science and faith. When the Big Bang theory was first heralded, Pope Pius XII, scientists are the figure of God. I think Big Bang science and religion have never been apart. I think they play good cop, bad cop, but they're together. That's all together with the Royal Society, all concocted. Alfane commented on Lemaitre's proposal. The appeal of the Big Bang has been more ideological than scientific. When men think about the universe, there is always a conflict between the mythical approach and the empirical scientific approach. In myth, one tries to deduce how the gods must have created the world, what perfect principles must have been used. It is not the purpose of this book to denigrate the Almighty. We simply contend that we do not need a spiritual argument to explain the sky. That's just crappy. Yeah, he's really taking that and running with it, isn't he? It's not that supernatural. At one point, I hate to be the bearer of this news, but at some point in the history of the universe, matter became living tissue, or a living being, if you will. That's a supernatural event. And I think the creative force, which resides in the electric force, conscious, is completely capable of doing it. I don't mean, striking and making a human. I don't really know what I mean, but I know what I know. If it sounds like it's ridiculous poppycock, it usually is. It's not the purpose of this book to denigrate the supernatural. The real cosmos is not invisible, immeasurable, or unknowable. We simply use our eyes, our brains, and the work product of the last 100 years, math, of serious electrical science. Oh, okay, it's not. If we do so, we shall see through the mystifying fog. After reading those paragraphs, TB's describing my work as being a theology is a low blow. Gratuitous comments such as this are an indication that his urge to attack me has become his reason. It is modern astrophysics that demands its followers believe in unseen, immeasurable entities, such as wimps, machos, dark matter, and inflatons. So what is a macho? Is that like, I'm picturing a little element like with a mustache? As a matter of faith, without proof. The reification of abstractions such as point masses, magnetic field lines, and mathematical singularity that can affect our classic theology transmogrifications, miracles. If TB wants to see a supporter of this species of creationism, he can simply look in the mirror. Conclusion. Astrophysics pseudo-skeptics like Bridgman have certain recognizable characteristics in common. They speak down to their audience, using arguments from authority. They refuse to consider any electrical causation for anything in space. Well, you know why. When confronted with equals in-your-face evidence, such as the image of a high redshifted QSO in front of a more distant, low redshifted galaxy, they resort to arguments usually involving math, statistics, to disprove, or at least make you doubt what your eyes are telling you. The old Groucho Marx line, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? They put forward their assumptions, as if they were universal truths. And we know that's true. The fact that they have been voted upon and accepted by self-involved insular group of experts does not make them true. Winning a hand vote is not the same thing as scientific validation. 5. It is clear that they have never been exposed to the basic properties of plasma, nor the fundamental interrelationships between magnetic fields and electric currents. But they feel free to lecture those who have. If the pseudo-skeptic has a monetary interest, such as maintaining a funding stream or a salary, his criticisms often become vituperative. Because I see no willingness on Bridgman's part to discuss things calmly with mutual respect, he remains, in my view, simply one more pseudo-skeptic who claims to know it all, not an open-minded scientist. Don Scott, editor's note. As noted above, these are just a few excerpts from the rebuttal, which covers the following topics: pulsars, misrepresentations of what I say, the non-useful products of astrophysics, the importance of in situ measurements, trusting mathematical models, it looks like X, so it must be X, the ad hominem attacks, gravitational lensing. General relativity does not include electromagnetism. Naked singularities are not black holes. Outflows from accreting black holes are not Hawking radiation. Gravity versus electricity. Solar and nuclear energy errors. Missing neutrinos. Nuclear reactions in solar flares, powering the sun from the outside. Sun's magnetic field currents in space. Crater formation. Dark matter. The W map. Double layers. Magnetic field easier to measure. Open magnetic field lines. Reconnection. Neutron stars. Lack of mathematics. Non-numerical axes. Lumped circuit elements. Where does the energy come from? More like creationism than I expected. Binary-powered pulsars. Observations. Conclusion. A full copy of Dr. Scott's rebuttal in PDF format can be obtained here. I got the link. I'll leave it in the description for you. That's from Thunderbolts, an overview of Don Scott's book. Please visit The Electric Sky, and that's where we're headed right now. Saturn theory overview. The Saturn theory arose from a historical argument, in the sense that that argument relates to the human past, as implied by the details of human memory in ancient times, and by human artifacts, in ways that will be obvious. However, the historical argument raises numerous questions of physical fact and physical theory, some of which will not be readily resolved, and several of which may well stand as serious obstacles in the minds of skeptically minded, feet-on-the-ground folks. One obvious and immediate question is whether something as ambiguous as myth could actually qualify as evidence. The historical argument focuses on points of agreement in the memories of widespread races, suggesting levels of coherence, often missed by historians and anthropologists, and raising the possibility that this coherence arises from a core of human experience that has been missed as well. There is an overarching idea in this argument. We've not only misunderstood the past, we've failed to recognize the consistency of ancient memory in pointing to extraordinary events never considered by modern science. Remarkably, every motive of our early ancestors directs our attention to experiences impossible to comprehend in terms of any natural phenomena occurring today. This consistency will be seen even at the most fundamental levels of human memory, in the most deeply rooted themes of the first civilizations. 1. The universal memory of a former age of the gods. 2. the universal memory of an ancestral golden age, inaugurating the age of the gods. 3. The universal memory of a celestial king of the world, whose life inspired the ancestral leap into civilization. 4. Description of the gods as luminaries of immense size and power, wielding weapons of thunder and stone. 5. The universal claim that the ancient world evolved by critical phases or cycles, punctuated by sweeping catastrophe. 6. Global traditions of gods and heroes ruling for a time, then departing amid terrifying spectacles and upheavals. 7. The frequently stated transfiguration of the departed gods into distant stars. 8. The identification of the ruling gods with planets in the first astronomies. 9. The relentless urge of star worshippers to draw pictures of celestial forms never seen in our sky. 10. The desperate yearning to recover the semblance of a lost cosmic order. 11. Their collective efforts to replicate in architecture the towering forms claimed to have existed in primeval times. 12. Their festive recreations through mystery, plays, and symbolic rites of cosmic violence and disorder. 13. Their reputation through ritual sacrifice of the deaths or ordeals of the gods. 14. The brutal and ritualistic wars of expansion, celebrated as a repetition of the cosmic devastation wrought in the wars of the gods. Such motives as these constitute, in fact, the most already verifiable underpinnings of ancient ritual, myth, and symbol. How strange that in our incessant glance backwards, the builders of the first civilizations never remembered anything resembling the natural world in which we live. What is needed in the face of unusual but widely repeated memories is brutal intellectual honesty. How did human consciousness emerge from the womb of nature, converge on the same improbable ideas, contradicting nature? For centuries we've lived under the illusion that our ancestors simply made up explanations of natural phenomena they didn't understand. But that's not the problem. What the myth makers interpreted or explained through stories and symbols and ritual reenactments is an unrecognized world, a world of alien sights and sounds, of celestial forms, of cosmic spectacles and earth-shaking events that do not occur in our world. That is the problem. From an evaluation of the global themes of ancient cultures, we have hypothesized a world order never envisioned by mainstream theory, a world in which planets moved on different courses, appearing huge in the sky. Heaven-spanning celestial forms dominated human imagination to the point of obsession at the time of civilization's birth. Our contention will be that hundreds of ancient themes speak for a unified experience, an experience more specific in context and detail than any of us had ever imagined when we started our research. No universal theme stands alone or in isolation from any of the others. All are connected. All speak for the presence of a coherent memory beneath the surface of seemingly random detail. In offering these summaries, I am not asking or expecting anyone to embrace the extraordinary theory of planetary history involved, only to consider highly interesting evidence. One of the values of this reinterpretation of evidence is the model
works, and it explains the subject matter. Hence, whatever you may think of the claimed events, merely discovering the active memory will throw remarkable new light on the ancient structures of human consciousness. In the course of these summaries, questions and challenges will be welcome, and wherever possible, I will try to incorporate these into the narrative as we go along. End of Part 1. David Talbott.
And it is easily understandable that the imagination of the peoples should be preoccupied with them, and should ascribe to them mythological deeds. Yet the ancient mythologies of the Chaldeans, the Romans, the Hindus, the Mayans, preoccupied themselves not with the sun or the moon, but prima facie with the planets. Marduk, the great god of the Babylonians, was the planet Jupiter. So was Ammon of the Egyptians, Zeus of the Greeks, and Jupiter of the Romans. It was much superior to the Greeks, superior to Shamash, Helios, the sun. Why was it revered by all peoples? Why was the planet Mars chosen to be the personification of the god of war? Why did Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, play a part in hundreds of myths and legends? Thoth of the Egyptians, Nebo and Nergal of the Babylonians, Mithra and Mazda of the Persians, Vishnu and Shiva of the Hindus, Bachi-Palazzi and Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans were a personification of planets. Innumerable hymns were dedicated to them, and adventures and exploits ascribed to them. The life of our planet has its real source in the sun, wrote E. Renan. All force is a transformation of the sun. Before religion had gone so far as to proclaim that God must be placed in the absolute and the ideal, that is to say, outside of the world, one cult only was reasonable and scientific, and that was the cult of the sun. But the sun was subordinate to the planets, even though they are not conspicuous, poor sources of light, and no sources of warmth. The night sky illuminated by stars is majestic. The geometrical figures of the constellations such as Pleiades, Orion, the Great Bear, rolling from east in the evening to west before morning, are favorite motifs in poetry, no less than the sun and the moon. But the discrepancy in the choice of motifs by the ancients becomes still more obvious. The constellations of the sky took only a minor and incidental part in the mythology of the ancient peoples. The planets were the major gods, and they rule the universe. It is not easy to understand the idea, which was the basis for the identification of the Babylonian gods with the planets, writes an author, but the same process of identification of major gods with the planets can be found in the religions of the peoples in all parts of the world. The planets were not affiliated to the gods or symbols of the gods. They were the gods. In prayers and liturgies, they were invoked as gods. The greater gods, even when addressed by the name in prayer, were regarded as astral powers. This or that planet is selected according to the text of the prayer from the multitude of the stars of heaven to receive a gift. The planetary gods are much the most powerful of all. Their positions in the sky, their reciprocal relations, have a decisive influence on all physical and moral phenomena of the world. The great majority of us moderns pay no attention to these points in the night sky, and probably not 1 in 10 or even in 100 is able to point to Jupiter or Mars in the firmament. The planets change their places, but not conspicuously. Were they indebted for their deification to this slow movement by which they differ from the fixed stars? Did Zeus, Jupiter, Marduk, Ammon, become the supreme deity, the thunderer and dreadful lord of the universe, only because of his slow movement? He passes in 12 years the cycle of the zodiac, traversed by the sun in 24 hours, and by the moon even quicker. When seen with the naked eye, the planet Jupiter distinguishes itself from the fixed stars of first magnitude only by this slow change of position. Augustine, confused by the problem of the deification of the planets, wrote in the 4th century, "But possibly these stars which have been called by their names are these gods. They call a certain star Mercury, and likewise a certain other star Mars. But among those stars which are called by the name of gods is that one which they call Jupiter, and yet with them Jupiter is the world. There also is that one they call Saturn, and yet they give him no small property beside, namely all seeds. Mercury, the closest to the sun, is barely visible, being hidden in the sun's rays. But the ancients made the planet Mercury into a great god, Hermes or Nebo. Why was it feared and worshipped? What is there generally in the planets to inspire awe, so as to influence people to build temples for them, to sing liturgies, to bring sacrifices, to narrate legends, and to dedicate to them the domain of science, of war, of agriculture? The key to this problem, which is the major problem of all classical mythology, is already in our hands. The planet Venus was deified because of its dramatic appearance and because of the havoc it brought to the world, as described in the Worlds in Collision. I illuminated also the events which made Mars a feared god. Divine qualities were ascribed to the other planets because of the catastrophes they wrought in earlier ages. In the Persian holy books, it is said that on the planets depends the existence or non-existence of the world. Wherefore are they especially to be venerated? The 7 planets rule the universe, says a Nabatean inscription. The Greeks and Romans believed that everything is in fact subject to the changes brought about by the revolutions of the stars. The celestial orbs, by their combined movements, are the authors of all that was and is to come. According to ancient Hebrew traditions, there are 7 archangels, each of whom is associated with a planet. The 7 archangels were believed to play an important part in the universal order through their associations with the planets. The reason for the deification of the planets lay in the fact that the planets, only a short time ago, were not faultlessly circling celestial bodies, nor were they harmless. This is also expressed in a Mandean text. How cruel are the planets to stay there and conspire evil in their rage. The planets conspire in rage against us. References. These identifications are discussed below, Part 4, Jupiter of the Thunderbolt. For ancient planetary worship among the Babylonians, among the Egyptians.
Astronomische und astrologische Inschriften alt-ägyptische Denkmäler, Leipzig, 1883, E-Novel, The Destruction des Hommes par les Dieux, Transactions of the Society for Biblical Archaeology IV, 1875, pp. Norgebauer and Apaka, Egyptian Astronomical Texts, London, 1969. Among the Hebrews, C.M. Seligson, Star Worship in the Jewish Encyclopedia, New York, 1905, cf. L. Ginsberg, The Legends of the Jews, Philadelphia, 1925, Volume 3, p. 371, Volume 6.
Among the Persians, see the
Dabistan.
Dabistan. Babylonian Magic and Sorcery, London, 1896. L.W. King. I'd like to get a hold of that book. Maybe not. I don't know. The City of God, 1907, by M. Dodds. This was the teaching of Anaxagoras, as reported Diogenes. The deification of the planets is advocated in the Platonic Eponymus 471. The origin of belief among the Greeks in the divinity of the heavenly bodies. Harvard, 1940. Symbolism, astronomy, mystique, Jewish magic and superstition. New York, 1939. Saturn was called the god of seeds, or of sowing, also the lord of field fruits. A deluge destroying much faunal life must have caused a dissemination of plants. In many places, new forms of vegetation must have sprouted from the rich soil fertilized by lava and mud. Seeds were carried from all parts of the globe, and in many instances, because of the change in climate, they were able to grow in new surroundings. The axis of the Earth was displaced, the orbit changed, the speed of rotation altered, the conditions of irrigation became different. The composition of the atmosphere was not the same. Entirely new conditions of growth prevailed. Ovid thus describes the exuberant growth of vegetation following the flood. After the old moisture remaining from the flood had grown warm from the rays of the sun, the slime of the wet marshes swelled with heat, and the fertile seeds of life nourished in that life-giving soil, as in a mother's womb, grew, and in time took on some special form. When, therefore, the earth covered with mud from the recent flood became heated up by the hot and genial rays of the sun, she brought forth innumerable forms of life, in part of ancient shapes, and in part creatures new and strange. The innumerable new forms of life in the animal and plant kingdoms following the deluge could have been solely a result of multiple mutations, although this seems a sufficient explanation of why and how Saturn came to be credited with the work of dissemination and mutation. The mention of another possibly should not be omitted. If it is true that the Earth passed through the gases exploded from Saturn, it should not be entirely excluded that germs were carried together with meteorites and gases and thus reached the Earth. The scholarly world in recent years has occupied itself with the idea that microorganisms, living cells or spores, can reach the Earth from interstellar spaces. Carried along by the pressure of light rays, the explosion of a planet is a more likely method of carrying seeds and spores through interplanetary spaces. The new forms of life could be the result of mutations, a subject I have discussed in Earth and Abuse, but the possibility that seeds were carried away from an exploding planet cannot be dismissed either. Saturn was credited with the introduction of agriculture in Italy. In Greece, Kronos was closely associated with the harvest of grain. Among the Egyptians, it was said that Osiris is seed. And in Babylonia, during the festival marking the drowning of Tammuz, grains and plants were thrown upon the waves. Tammuz. In Babylonia, during the festival marking the drowning of Tammuz, grains and plants were thrown upon the waves. The effects of nearby supernovae on the biospheres have been the object of intensive study by a geologist in recent years. In an attempt to account for abrupt changes in the history of life on this planet, C.D. Russell and W. Tucker, Supernova and the Extinction of the Dinosaurs, Nature, February 19, 1971. Sudden extinctions were followed by the appearance of new species, quite different from those preceding them in the stratigraphic record. In a relatively brief interval, whole genera were annihilated, giving way to new creatures of radically different aspect, having little in common with the forms they replaced. N.D. Newell, Revolution in the History of Life, Geological Society of America, Special Papers. Punctuated equilibria, the tempo and mode of evolution reconsidered, 1977. Thus, over the past 2 to 3 decades, many geologists and paleontologists have found themselves increasingly drawn to the view that the observed abrupt changes in the biosphere, such as that which marked the end, the Mesozoic, and is thought to have brought with it the extinction of the dinosaurs, among other animal groups, could best be explained by the exposure of then living organisms to massive doses of radiation coming from a nearby supernova. The radiation would annihilate many species, especially those whose representatives, whether because of their large size or for other reasons, were unable to shield themselves from the powerful rays. At the same time, new organisms would be created through mutations and macroevolution. See Velikovsky's comments in The Pitfalls of Radiocarbon Dating. In the catastrophe of the deluge, which I ascribe to Saturn exploding as a nova, the cosmic rays must have been very abundant to cause massive mutations among all species of life. Animals would suffer much more severely than plants. On plants, the principal effective would be mutagenic. See K.D. Terry and W.H. Tucker, Biologic Effects of Supernovae, 1968. Fred Hoyle, Does Epidemic Disease Come from Outer Space? 17th November, 1977.
Should be a good interplay for that song. Let's see, where is it? Nah, forget it. All right, well, next thing I'm going to play is the preface to Earth and Upheaval. I think that this has a nice message in it. Enjoy. Earth and Upheaval is a book about the great tribulations to which the planet on which we travel was subjected in prehistorical and historical times. The pages of this book are transcripts of the testimony of mute witnesses, the rocks, in the court of celestial traffic. They testify by their own appearance and by the encased contents of dead bodies, fossilized skeletons. Myriads upon myriads of living creatures came to life on this ball of rock, suspended in nothing, and returned to dust. Many died a natural death. Many were killed in wars between races and species, and many were entombed alive during the great paroxysms of nature in which land and sea contested in destruction. Whole tribes of fish that had filled the oceans suddenly ceased to exist. Of entire species and even genera of land animals, not a single survivor was left. The earth and the water, without which we cannot exist, suddenly turned into enemies, and engulfed the animal kingdom, the human race included. And there was no shelter and no refuge. In such cataclysms, the land and the sea repeatedly changed places, laying dry the kingdom of the ocean and submerging the kingdoms of the land. In Worlds in Collision, I presented the chronicles
of two, the very last series of such catastrophes, those that visited our Earth in the second and first millennia before the present era. Since these upheavals occurred in historical times, when the art of writing had already been perfected in the centers of ancient civilization, I describe them mainly from historical documents, relying on celestial charts, calendars, and sundials, and water clocks, discovered by archaeologists, and drawing also upon classical literature, the sacred literature of East and West, the epics of the northern races, and the oral traditions of the primitive peoples from Lapland to the South Seas, geological vestiges of the events narrated in documents and traditions were indicated only here and there. When I felt that the immediate testimony of the rocks must be presented along with the historical evidence, I closed that description of cataclysmic events with a promise to attempt at a later date the reconstruction of similar global catastrophes of earlier times, one of them being the deluge. I had intended, after piecing together the history of these upheavals, to present geological and paleontological material to support the testimony of man, but the reception of Worlds in Collision by certain scientific groups persuaded me, before reviving the pageant of earlier catastrophes, to present, at least, some of the evidence of the rocks, which is as insistent as that carried down to our times by written records and by word of mouth. This testimony is never given in metaphors, and as with the pages of the Old Testament or of the Iliad, nothing can be changed in it. Pebbles and rocks and mountains in the bottom of the sea will bear witness. Do they know of the days, recent and ancient, when the harmony of this world was interrupted by the forces of nature? Do they know of the days, recent and ancient, when the harmony of this world was interrupted by the forces of nature? Have they entombed innumerable creatures and encased them in rock? Have they seen the ocean moving on continents and the continents sliding under water? Was this earth and the expanse of its seas showered with stones and covered by ashes? Were its forests uprooted by hurricanes and set afire, covered by tides carrying sand and debris from the bottom of the ocean? It takes millions of years for a log to be turned into coal, but only a single hour when burning. Here lies the core of the problem. Did the earth change in a slow process, a year added to a year and a million to a million? The peaceful ground of nature being the broad arena of the contest of throngs in which the fittest survived? Or did it happen, too, that the very arena itself, infuriated, rose against the contestants and made an end of their battles? I present here some pages from the Book of Nature. I have excluded from them all references to ancient literature, traditions, and folklore, and this I have done with intent, so that careless critics cannot decry the entire work as tales and legends. Stones and bones are the only witnesses. Mute as they are, they will testify clearly and unequivocally, yet dull ears and dimmed eyes will deny this evidence, and the dimmer the vision, the louder and more insistent will be the voices of protestation. This book was not written for those who swear by the verba magistri, the holiness of their school wisdom, and they may debate it without reading it as well. Author's note. In the body of Earth in Upheaval, I found nothing demanding revocation or change from the original edition of November 1955. Since then, it has been reprinted unchanged many times. Books just, I think they're still being, I don't know if they're out of print yet, but his books have always been successful. The uncompromising stand of the followers of uniformitarian dogma, whether called gradualists, evolutionists, or Darwinists, or Big Bangers, they're all three in cahoots with the Royal Society, maintaining that nothing of radical change in nature has taken place in the past because nothing like it is observable at present. A view without logic, imagination, or basis in fact began to show signs of fracturing, pressing deeper cracks, and in ultimate collapse, the term cataclysmic evolution
entered scientific literature. The term new catastrophism was offered to let it appear that the new tenets differ from Velikovsky's views, and a minor key was struck repeatedly, even in recognizing the interference of elementary forces in the course of history. Thus, the great global disturbances of the 15th or 8th century before the present era were made to appear as the result of an explosion of a single volcano, Thera, in the Aegean Sea. Yet, in some instances, like the discovery of the great submarine ridge encompassing the globe almost twice, the discoverer felt compelled to exclaim in print, "The discovery at this late date of the mid-ocean ridge and rift has raised fundamental questions about basic geological processes and the history of the Earth, and has even had reverberations in cosmology." And his discovery of the whitish ash underlying the beds of all the oceans and seas, the so-called Worzel ash, J.L. Worzel, was led to exclaim in print, "It may be necessary to attribute the layer to a worldwide volcanism, or perhaps to the fiery end of bodies of cosmic origin." And then occasionally I was confronted with entire faculties of geophysicists, as in Madison, Wisconsin, in 1967. Who would claim that all signs of catastrophes resulted but from local events. I would prefer to the findings of Hazine or Worzel, or ask what local event could change the level of all oceans 34 centuries ago, as realized by R. Daly of Harvard in 1930, and confirmed by P. Kuchnin 1959, or change the climate all over the world, both 34 and 27 centuries ago. As clearly as the 1960s, I found that Earth in upheaval was displacing the origin of species in the courses of a number of geophysics. As in the case of my visit to Oberlin College in 1965 at Princeton University, Earth in Upheaval, from its publication, and for 2 decades, was required reading in the paleontology course of Professor Glenn Jepson, H.H. Hess, chairman of the Department of Geology, later Geophysics, told me that he knew Earth in Upheaval by heart. He debated it with me at the first open meeting of Cosmos and Chronos, which he founded on the campus of Princeton University in January 1965 for study and discussion of my work. Such groups sprang up on other campuses too. Today, the groups studying in the physical and geophysical fields find a center in Cosmos and Chronos physical sciences. I said I would not revoke anything from the original, it's hard to make that word out, that's a little better, edition of 1955. However, to one section I would like to make some pertinent remarks. By the 1950s, the hypothesis, 1920, of A. Wagner about drifting continents gained an acceptance for the advancement of science. A roll call showed equal numbers of supporters and opponents. In the later 60s, the trend took a dramatic turn. The ever unsatisfactory part of the hypothesis, the nature of the force that causes the continents to drift, and unequal attraction of the moon on various latitudes, Wagner, and periodical radioactive heating of the interior of the Earth, du Toit, was tackled anew, and in some unintended way I had a part in it. Here is the story. The forum address before the graduate forum of Princeton University, printed as a supplement at the end of this book, was read on October 14, 1953. In it, I claimed that Jupiter, being a charged body, emits radio signals, and that Earth, being a charged body, possesses a magnetosphere, and further, that this magnetosphere reaches all the way to the lunar orbit. All 3 claims were subsequently confirmed under dramatic circumstances and mark epochal detections. But under pressure of a campaign led by elite of the scientific community, I was barred for over 9 years from any contact with the student body.
Well, that's just dirty. Except when H. Hess had his say. A number of times following the publication of Earth in Upheaval, late in 1955, Hess invited me to speak to an audience of the professors and graduate students of his department. My position on continental drift was, and is, intermediary between that of those who reject his concept, H. Jeffreys, the leading British geophysicist, and V.V. Belousov, the leading Russian geophysicist, never ceased to be its most outspoken opponents. And those who support the idea. I would therefore not recognize the outline of the present continents as everlasting features, only extended by the drift of continents. The moving force was there by inertia, and the displacement of the strata could continue at an ever-diminishing rate for centuries. The volcanic activity and earthquakes I described resulting from these very occurrences, and decreasing with time. Once a professor from the University of Rhodesia came to a lecture at the same auditorium where I usually offered my challenge, and told that this expedition found the magnetic remnant intensity of lavas in Somalia and Ethiopia 1,000-fold stronger than the terrestrial magnetic field. Half a Gauss could invest in these lavas when cooling below the Pierre Curie point. Further, he described that in Arabia, the magnetic remnant direction was found reversed from that of neighboring Somalia and Ethiopia on the African coast. Once more, I teased the audience. You have to turn around Arabia in relation to Africa. If you wish to explain the phenomenon by continental drift and the 1,000-fold strong magnetic remnants, you cannot explain even by rotating Arabia. One day, Hess showed me a design he was making of loops of magma traveling from the molten interior of the Earth toward its crust. He wished to hear my opinion on such loops. As a source of energy for moving continents, I did not show appreciation of such loops, entirely hypothetical, actually figments of an imagination. For a while I did not know that Harry, we started to call each other by our given names, made his theory known. I knew of enthusiastic supporters of plate tectonics, like J. Tuzo Wilson of Toronto, but only from Walter Sullivan's Continents in Molten, 1974, did I learn that Hess was the originator of the idea, and then I remembered these incidents. Paul Wesson of Cambridge University collected from scientific literature over 70 arguments against plate tectonics and drifting continents. I remain unswayed, either by the enthusiasts or by their opponents. Only by learning what happened to the Earth less than 4,000 years ago, of which we have an inexhaustible store of human testimony, a little of which is collected in Worlds in Collision, and another store of unexplained, but carry its own explanation, scenery from all latitudes and longitudes, may we arrive at the understanding which so many are still afraid to face.
Electric gravity in an electric universe. If a special geometry has to be invented in order to account for a falling apple, even Newton might be appalled at the complications which would ensue when really difficult problems are tackled. Sir Oliver Lodge, 1921. This news item is shortened and modified from a presentation given in Cambridge, England in September 2007, and notes are therefore included. Gravity is the most familiar force. We are subjected to it every day of our lives. Newton gave us his law of gravity, which describes its effect, but doesn't explain it. I frame no hypothesis, he wrote. Einstein wasn't so prudent when he introduced his postulates. Unfortunately, his unreal geometry doesn't explain gravity either. The usual demonstration using heavy steel balls on a rubber sheet to represent gravity wells relies on gravity as its own explanation. In fact, the fact that we do not understand gravity in this space age should cause alarm. Our cosmology, our view of our situation in the universe, is based on a mystery. The Big Bang is a monumentally expensive work of fiction. We missed a chance to include electricity in astronomy in the early 1900s. Birkeland was performing his electrical Little Earth or Torella experiments in Norway, and Gauss and Weber were discovering the electrical interactions of matter. Today, physicists labor under misconceptions about the nature of matter and space. The relationship between matter, mass, and gravity, the electrical nature of stars and galaxies, and the size, history, and age of the universe. So when astrophysicists turn to particle physicists to solve their intractable problems, and particle physicists use it as an excuse for squandering billions of dollars on futile experiments, neither party recognizes that the other discipline is in a perilous state. After all, to get the whole universe totally wrong in the face of clear evidence for over 75 years merits monumental embarrassment and should induce a modicum of humility. The standard model of particle physics would appear to fail in nearly every possible way, and all of its failures seem to stem from the early 1930s. By all indications, science seems to have taken a wrong turn about this time. After 300 years of progressively simplifying the description of the universe with fewer entities and simpler laws, it suddenly turned the other way, with complexity and entities multiplying like rabbits. We are about to enter the 21st century. I think this was written a while ago. We are about to enter the 21st century, but our understanding of the origin of inertia, mass, gravitation, still remains what has been for centuries an outstanding puzzle. How has this situation arisen? In the 20th century, technology perfected wireless communication and computers and got man into space, while fundamental science fell deeper into a black hole of complication, illogicality, and metaphysics. I consider the principal cause has been the usurping, since Einstein, of natural philosophy and physics by theoretical mathematicians. Meanwhile, Einstein, perhaps to his credit, remained skeptical of his own work. I have always found it instructive to read what past luminaries of science thought of a radically new idea. The free exchange of opposing opinions is later stifled by the bandwagon effect. Science, like all human endeavors, is subject to fads and fallacies. When controversy was still tolerated over Einstein's theories, Sir Oliver Lodge, a noted fellow of the Royal Society, wrote in Nature on February 17, 1921, "What is really wanting for a truly natural philosophy is a supplement to Newtonian mechanics, expressed in terms of the medium which he suspected and sought after, but could not attain, and introducing the additional facts, chiefly electrical, especially the fact of variable inertia discovered since his time. If we could understand the structure of the particle in terms of the medium of which it is composed, and if we knew the structure of the rest of the medium also, so as to account for the potential stress at every point, that would be a splendid step, beyond anything accomplished yet. This is precisely the electric universe view. Natural philosophy has withered in its confrontation with the modern fashion of mathematical metaphysics
and computer games. Most of the discoveries now are merely computer-generated virtual reality, black holes, dark matter, dark energy, etc. The computer models are constructed upon a shadowy kernel of ignorance. We do not understand gravity. Einstein, in his special theory of relativity, postulated that there was no medium called the ether. But Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism requires it. And Sir Oliver Lodge saw the ether as crucial to our understanding. So Einstein, at a stroke, removed any possibility that he or his followers would find a link between electromagnetism and gravity. It served the egos of his followers to consecrate Einstein's ideas and treat dissent as blasphemy. Sometimes a concept is baffling, not because it is profound, but because it is wrong. Decades later, Paul R. Hale wrote in Scientific Monthly, May 1954, "The more we study gravitation, the more there grows upon us the feeling that there is something peculiarly fundamental about this phenomenon, to a degree that is unequaled among other natural phenomena. Its independence of the factors that affect other phenomena and its dependence only upon mass and distance suggest that its roots avoid things superficial and go down deep into the unseen, to the very essence of space. Gravitation still a mystery." This sentiment has been echoed down to the present, but few are listening. The problem has been worsened by the particle physicists who indulge in their own virtual reality, inventing virtual particles to transmit forces. If they could understand the structure of the particle in terms of the medium of which it is composed, and put flesh on the metaphysical bones of quantum theory, we should be much further advanced. Sir Oliver Lodge deserves to be heard once more. It may be that when the structure of an electron is understood, we shall see that an even-powered stress in the surrounding ether is necessarily involved. What I do feel instinctively is that this is the direction for discovery, and what is needed is something internal and intrinsic, and that all attempts to explain gravitation as due to the action of some external agency, whether flying particles or impinging waves, are doomed to failure. For all these speculations regard the atom as a foreign substance, a sort of grit in the ether, driven hither and thither by forces alien to itself. When someday we understand the real relation between matter and ether, I venture to predict that we shall perceive something more satisfying than that. Electric gravity. In 1850, Faraday performed experiments trying to link gravity with electromagnetism that were unsuccessful. However, his conviction remained. The long and constant persuasion that all the forces of nature are mutually dependent, having one common origin, or rather being different manifestations of one fundamental power, has often made me think on the possibility of establishing by experiment a connection between gravity and electricity. No terms could exaggerate the value of the relation they would establish. Faraday's estimate of the importance of such a concoction still stands. Today, there are a number of scholars pursuing this obvious line of inquiry. After all, the electrical and gravitational forces share fundamental characteristics. They both diminish with the inverse square of the distance. They are both proportional to the product of the interacting masses or charges, and both forces act along the line between them.
Matter and mass. Gravity acts in proportion to the mass of an object. What do we mean when we refer to the mass of an object? One of the most astonishing features of the history of physics is the confusion which surrounds the definition of the key term in dynamics, mass. Early in the 20th century, numerous textbooks equated the mass of an object to its weight. That equation led to confusion because it doesn't explain why the mass of an object we measure on a weighing machine, gravitational mass, is identical to the mass of that object when we push it, inertial mass. When it was found that atoms are composed of charged particles, there were attempts to explain mass in terms of electromagnetism.
Henry Poincaré
wrote in 1914, "What we call mass would seem to be nothing but an appearance, in all inertia, to be of electromagnetic origin. It makes good sense that the equivalence of gravitational and inertial mass should be explained by the electrical structure of matter. However, it is not the philosophical concept of mass, but its mathematical treatment that occupies physicists." Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, demonstrated that mass and electromagnetic energy are directly related. But mystification resulted when the earlier concept that related mass to quantity of matter was unconsciously substituted. Textbooks and encyclopedias today slip unnoticeably into the error of using the words mass and matter interchangeably. A NASA educational website tells us that mass is a measure of how much matter a planet is made of. It shows that the confusion of mass with quantity of matter infects astrophysics. The consequences are profound for cosmology. The mass of a celestial body cannot tell us about its composition. We cannot say what the sun is made from. Another example is comet nuclei, which are electrically charged bodies. They register masses that should have them constructed like an empty sponge, yet they look like solid rock. It is their appearance together with the recently recovered high-temperature minerals, rock particles, from a comet that give the accurate picture. Comets and asteroids are fragments of planets. They are not primordial, quite the reverse, in fact. Gravity does not refer to time. We must have a workable concept of the structure of matter that satisfies the observation that the inertial and gravitational masses of an object are equivalent when we accelerate electrons or protons in an electromagnetic field. They become less responsive to the fields the more they are accelerated. This has been interpreted as an increase in particle mass, which is unhelpful until we understand the origin of mass. If the charged subtrons have little intrinsic mass, how do they, in combination, give the electron, proton, and neutron the property of mass? End of part 1.
Well, that's going to do it for this show. 2 hours. That's what I want to keep it at. It went by real fast for me. I had a great time. I'd like to thank you for watching with me. It means a lot to me. All right, I'm gonna upload this to a premiere on YouTube tonight. So I'll be there. All right. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
other faculty members at times
Hmm.
within Boston University, not within my particular college or division, but like any big universities, there are numerous colleges and schools within the university, and people in an archaeology department in another college within the university, for instance, have denied that I'm a faculty member at Boston University. They did this behind my back
Wow.
in Egypt, for instance, and thought it would never get back to me. They've been very nasty. They've tried to get me fired, some of them. Have tried to make life miserable for me. I mean, what has protected me, and I think I'm in better shape now. A lot of this has occurred over the last quarter century since I got involved in this whole business about 1990 when I first went to Egypt.
Yeah.
And the early days of coming out, it was very difficult. A lot of criticism, a lot of nasty name calling. Academics can be very bitter, very nasty, very petty. There's a lot of vested interest. A lot of egos get bruised. So I've seen my share. Protected me in the sense that I'm still at Boston University, as I did not do any of this until I made sure I had tenure. And with the American tenure system, you can't fire someone for the research they're doing and the analyses and that type of thing. I mean, if you commit a physical crime or, there's other reasons you can be denied tenure, but